February 9th devotional, 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just, and will forgive us our sins and purify us from all unrighteousness.
Hey everybody, it's Susan. Welcome to my channel, Susan Diamond Paint.
Chapter 5. Neil went up the hill the next afternoon, just as the cutter with the two black ponies jingled around the driveway and stopped at the front door. Mrs. Forrester came out on the porch, dressed for a sleigh ride. Ellinger followed her, buttoned up in a long fur-lined coat, showily befogged down the front with a glossy Astron collar. He looked even more powerful and bursting with vigor than last night. His highly colored, well-visored countenance shone with a good opinion of himself and of the world. Mrs. Forrester called to Neil gaily, "We are going down to the Sweetwater to cut cedar boughs for Christmas. Will you keep Constance company? She seems a trifle disappointed at being left behind, but we can't take the big sleigh. The pole is broken. Be nice to her, there's a good boy." She pressed his hand and gave him a meaningful, confident smile and stepped into the sleigh. Ellinger sprang in beside her, and they glided down the hill with a merry tinkle of sleigh bells. Neil found Mrs. Ogden in the back parlor, playing solitaire by the fire. She was clearly out of humor. "Come in, Mr. Herbert. I think they might have taken us along, don't you? I want to see the river my own self. I hate being shut up in the house." "Let's go out then. Wouldn't you like to see the town?" Constance seemed not to hear him. She was wrinkling and unwrinkling her short nose, and the restless lines about her mouth were fluttering. "What's to hinder us from getting a sleigh at the livery barn and going down to Sweetwater? I don't suppose the river's private property." She gave a nervous, angry laugh and looked hopefully at Neil. We couldn't get anything at this hour. The livery teams are all out," he said with firmness. Constance glanced at him suspiciously, then sat down at the card table and leaned over it, drawing her plump shoulders together. Her fluffy yellow hair was wound round her head like a scarf and held in place by narrow bands of black velvet. The ponies had crossed the second creek and were trotting down the high road toward the river. Mrs. Forrester expressed her feelings in a laugh full of mischief. "Is she running after us? Where did she get the idea that she was to come? What a relief to get away!" She lifted her chin and sniffed the air. The day was gray without sun, and the air was still and dry, a warm cold. "Poor Mr. Ogden," she went on. "How much livelier he is without his ladies. They almost extinguish him. Now, aren't you glad you never married?" "I'm certainly glad I never married a homely woman. What does a man do for it anyway? She had no money, and he always had it, or been on the way to it." "Well, they're off tomorrow, and Connie, you've reduced her to a state of imbecility. Really, what an afternoon Neil must be having." She laughed as if the idea of his predicament delighted her. "Who's this kid, anyway?" Ellinger asked her to take the reins for a moment while he drew a cigar from his pocket. "He's a trifle stiff. Does he make himself useful?" "Oh, he's a nice boy. Stranded here like the rest of us. I'm going to train him to be very useful. He's devoted to Mr. Forrester. Handsome, don't you think?" So. They turned into a by-road that wound along the Sweetwater. Ellinger held the ponies in a little and turned down his high Astron collar. "Let's have a look at you, Marian." Mrs. Forrester was holding her muff before her face to catch the flying particles of snow the ponies kicked up. From behind it, she glanced at him sideways. "Well," she said teasingly. He put his arm through hers and settled himself low in the sleigh. "You ought to look at me better than that. It's been a devil of a long while since I've seen you." "Perhaps it's been too long," she murmured. The mocking spark in her eyes softened precipitously under the long pressure of his arm. "Yes, it's been long," she admitted lightly. "You didn't answer the letter I wrote to you on the 11th. "Didn't I? Well, at any rate, I answered your telegram." She drew her head away as his face came nearer. "You really have to watch the ponies, my dear, or they'll tumble us out into the snow." "I don't care. I wish they would," he said between his teeth. "Why didn't you answer my letter?" "Oh, I don't remember. You don't write so many." "It's no satisfaction. You won't let me write you love letters. You say it's risky." "So it is, and foolish. But now you needn't be so careful. Not too careful," she laughed softly. "When I'm off in the country for a whole winter, alone and growing older, I'd like to—" She put her hand on his, "to be reminded of pleasanter things." Ellinger took off his glove with his teeth, his eyes sweeping the winding road and the low, snow-covered bluffs had something wolfish in them. "Be careful, Frank, my rings! You hurt me." "Then why don't you take them off? You used to." "Are these your cedars? Shall we stop here?" "No, not here." She spoke very low. "The best ones are farther on, in a deep ravine that winds back into the hills." Ellinger glanced at her averted head, and his heavy lips twitched in a smile at one corner. The quality of her voice had changed, and he knew the change. They went spinning along the curves of the winding road, saying not a word. Mrs. Forster sat with her head bent forward, her face half hidden in her muff. At last she told him to stop. To the right of the road he saw a thicket. Behind it a dry water course wound into the bluffs. The tops of the dark, still cedars just visible from the road indicating its windings. "Sit still," he said, "while I take out the horses." When the blue shadows of approaching dusk were beginning to fall over the snow, one of the Blum boys, slipping quietly along through the timber in search of rabbits, came upon the empty cutter standing at the brush, and near it to the two ponies, stamping impatiently where they were tied. Adolf slid back into the thicket and lay down behind a fallen log to see what would happen. Not much ever happened to him but weather. Presently he heard low voices coming nearer from the ravine. The big stranger who was visiting at the Foresters emerged, carrying the buffalo robes in one arm. Mrs. Forster herself was clinging to the other. They walked slowly, wholly absorbed by what they were saying to each other. When they came upon the sleigh, the man spread the robes on the seat and put his hands under Mrs. Forster's arms to lift her in. But he did not lift her. He stood for a long while, holding her crushed up against his breast, her face hidden in his black overcoat. "What about those damn cedar boughs?" he asked, after he put her in and covered her up. "Shall I go back and cut some?" "It doesn't matter," she murmured. He reached under the seat for a hatchet and went back to the ravine. Mrs. Forster sat with her eyes closed, her cheek pillowed on her muff, a faint, soft smile on her lips. The air was still and blue. The Blum boy could almost hear her breathe. When the strokes of the hatchet rang out from the ravine, he could see her eyelids flutter. Soft shivers went through her body. The man came back and threw the evergreens into the sleigh. When he got in beside her, she slipped her hand through his arm and settled softly against him. "Drive slowly," she murmured, as if she were talking in her sleep. "It doesn't matter if we're late for dinner. Nothing matters." The ponies trotted off. The pale Blum boy rose from behind his log and followed the tracks up to the ravine. When the orange moon rose above the bluffs, he was still sitting under the cedars with his gun on his knee. While Mrs. Forster had been waiting there in the sleigh with her eyes closed, feeling so safe, he could have almost touched her with his hand. He had never seen her before when her mocking eyes and lively manner were not between her and all the world. If it had been Thad Grimes who lay behind that log now, or Ivy Peters. But with Adolf Bloom her secrets were safe. His mind was futile. The rich and fortunate were also the privileged. These warm-blooded, quick-breathing people took chances, followed impulses only dimly understandable to a boy who was wet and weather-chapped all the year, who waded in the mud fishing for cat or laying in the marsh waiting for wild duck. Mrs. Forster had never been too haughty to smile at him when he came to the back door with his fish. She never haggled about the price. She treated him like a human being. His little chats with her, her nod, and her smile when she passed him on the street were among the pleasant things he had to remember. She bought game of him in close season and didn't give him away. Chapter 6. It was during that winter, the first one Mrs. Forster had ever spent in the house on the hill, that Neil came to know her very well. For the Foresters that winter was a sort of isthmus between the two estates. Soon afterward came a change in their fortunes. And for Neil it was a natural turning point, since in the autumn he was 19 and in the spring he was 20, a very great difference. After the Christmas festivities were over, the whist parties settled into regular routine. 3 evenings a week, Judge Pomeroy and his nephew sat down to cards with the Foresters. Sometimes they went over early and dined there. Sometimes they stayed for a late supper after the last rubber. Neil, who had been so content with a bachelor's life, and who had made up his mind that he would never live in a place that was under the control of women, found himself becoming attached to the comforts of a well-conducted house, to the pleasures of the table, to the soft chairs and soft lights and agreeable human voices at the Foresters. On bitter, windy nights, sitting in his favorite blue chair before the grate, he used to wonder how he could manage to tear himself away to plunge into the outer darkness and run down the long frozen road and up the dead street of the town. Captain Forrester was experimenting with bulbs that winter and had built a little glass conservatory on the south side of the house, off the back parlor. Through January and February, the house was full of narcissus and Roman hyacinths, and their heavy spring-like odor made a part of the enticing comfort of the fireside there. Where Mrs. Forrester was, dullness was impossible, Neil believed. The charm of her conversation was not so much in what she said, though she was often witty, but in the quick recognition of her eyes and the living quality of her voice itself. One could talk with her about the most trivial things and go away with a high sense of elation. The secret of it, he supposed, was that she couldn't help being interested in people, even very commonplace people. If Mr. Ogden or Mr. Dalzell were not there to tell their best stories for her, then she would be amused by Ivy Peters' ruffianly manners, or the soft compliments of old man Elliot when he sold her a pair of winter shoes. She had a fascinating gift of mimicry. When she mentioned the fat Iceman or Thad Grimes at his meat block, or the Blum boys with their dead rabbits by a subtle suggestion of their manner, she made them seem more individual and vivid than they were in their own person. She often caricatured people to their faces, and they were not offended, but greatly flattered. Nothing pleased one more than to provoke her laughter. Then you felt you were getting on with her. It was her form of commenting, of agreeing with you and appreciating you when you said something interesting, and it often told you a great deal that was both too direct and too elusive for words. Long afterward, when Neil did not know whether Mrs. Forrester was living or dead, if her image flashed into his mind, it came with a brightness of dark eyes, her pale triangular cheeks with long earrings, and her many-colored laugh. When he was dull, and tired of everything, he used to think that if he could hear that long-lost lady laugh again, he would be gay. The big storm of the winter came later that year, swept down over Sweetwater in the first day of March, and beat upon the town for 3 days and nights. 30 inches of snow fell, and the cutting wind blew it into whirling drifts. The Forresters were snowed in. Ben Keyser, their man of all work, did not attempt to break a road or even to come over into town himself. On the third day, Neil went to the post office, got the captain's leather mail sack with its accumulation of letters, and set off across the creek, plunging into drifts up to his middle, sometimes up to his armpits. The fences along the lane were covered, but he broke his trail by keeping between the two lines of the poplars. When at last he reached the front porch, Captain Forrester came to the door and let him in. "Glad to see you, my boy, very glad. It's been a little lonesome for us. You must have had hard work getting over. I certainly appreciate it. Come to the sitting room fire and dry yourself. We will talk quietly. Mrs. Forrester has gone upstairs to lie down. She's been complaining of a headache." Neil stood before the fire in his rubber boots drying his trousers. The captain did not sit down but opened the glass door to his little conservatory. "I've something pretty to show you, Neil. All my hyacinths are coming along at once, every color of the rainbow. The Roman hyacinths, I say, are Mrs. Forrester's. They seem to suit her." Neil went to the door and looked with keen pleasure at the fresh, watery blooms. "I was afraid you might lose them this bitter weather, Captain. No, these things can stand a good deal of cold. They've been company for us." He stood looking out through the glass at the defined shrubbery. Neil liked to see him look out over his place. "A man's house is his castle," his look seemed to say. "Ben tells me the rabbits have come up to the barn to eat the hay. Everything green is covered up. I had him throw a few cabbages out there for them so they won't suffer. Mrs. Forrester has been on the porch every day feeding the snowbirds," he went on, as if talking to himself. The stair door opened, and Mrs. Forrester came down in her Japanese dressing gown, looking very pale. The dark shadows under her eyes seemed to mean that she had been losing sleep. "Oh, it's Neil. How nice of you. And you brought the mail. Are there any letters for me?" "3. 2 from Denver and 1 from California. Her husband gave them to her. Did you sleep, matey?" "No, but I rested. It's delightful up in the west room. The wind sings and whistles about the eaves. If you'll excuse me, I'll dress and glance at my letters." Stand closer to the fire, Neil. Are you very wet? When she stooped beside him to feel his clothes, he smelled a sharp odor of spirits. Was she ill, he wondered, or merely so bored that she'd been trying to dull herself? When she came back, she had dressed and rearranged her hair. "Mrs. Forrester," said the captain in a solicitous tone, "I believe I would like some tea and toast this afternoon, like your English friends, and it would be good for your head. We won't offer Neil anything else." "Very well. Mary has gone to bed with a toothache, but I will make the tea. Neil can make the toast here by the fire while you read your paper." She was cheerful now, tied one of Mary's aprons about Neil's neck, and set him down with a toasting fork. He noticed that the captain, as he read his paper, kept his eye on the sideboard with a certain watchfulness, and when his wife brought the tray with tea, no sherry, he seemed very much pleased. He drank 3 cups and took a second piece of toast. "You see, Mr. Forrester," she said lightly, "Neil has brought back my appetite. I ate no lunch today," turning to the boy. "I've been shut up too long. Is there anything in the papers?" This meant, was there any news concerning the people they knew? The captain put on his silver-rimmed glasses again and read aloud about the doings of their friends in Denver and Omaha and Kansas City. Mrs. Forrester sat on a stool by the fire, eating toast and making humorous comments upon the subjects of these solemn paragraphs. The engagement of Miss Irma Salton Smith, etc. "At last, thank God, you remember her, Neil. She's been here. I think you danced with her." "I don't think I do. What is she like?" "She's exactly like her name. Don't you remember? Tall, very animated, glittering eyes like the ancient mariners." Neil laughed. "Don't you like bright eyes, Mrs. Forrester?" "Not any others, I don't." She joined in his laugh so gaily that the captain looked over his paper with an expression of satisfaction. He let the journal slowly crumble on his knees and sat watching the two beside the grate. To him they seemed about the same age. It was a habit with him to think of Mrs. Forrester as very, very young. She noticed that he was not reading. "Would you like me to light the lamp, Mr. Forrester?" "No, thank you. The twilight is very pleasant." It was twilight by now. They heard Mary come downstairs and begin stirring about the kitchen. The captain, his slippers in the zone of firelight and his heavy shoulders in shadow, snored from time to time. As the room grew dusky, the windows were squares of clear pale violet, and the shutters ceased to rattle. The wind was dying with the day. Everything was still except for the Bohemian Mary, roughly clattered a pan. Mrs. Forrester whispered that she was out of sorts because her sweetheart, Joe Pullick, hadn't been over to see her. Sunday night was his regular night, and Sunday was the first day of the blizzard. When she's neglected, her tooth always begins to ache. "Well, now that I've got over, he'll have to come, or she'll be in a temper." "Oh, he'll come," Mrs. Forrester shrugged. "I am blind and deaf, but I am quite sure she makes it worth his while." After a few moments she rose. "Come," she whispered. "Mr. Forrester is asleep. Let's run down the hill. There's no one to stop us. I'll slip on my rubber boots. No objections." She put her fingers to his lips. "Not a word. I can't stand this house a moment longer." They slipped quietly out of the front door into the cold air which tasted of new-fallen snow. A clear arc of blue and rose color painted the west over the buried town. When they reached the rounded breast of the hill, blown almost bare, Mrs. Forrester stood still and drew in deep breaths, looking down over the drifted meadows and stiff blue poplars. "Oh, but it is bleak," she murmured. "Suppose we should have to stay here all next winter, too, and the next. What will become of me, Neil?" There was fear, unmistakably fright in her voice. "You see, there's nothing for me to do. I get no exercise, I don't skate, we did in California, and my ankles are weak. I've always danced in the winter. There's plenty of dancing at Colorado Springs. You would believe how I miss it. I shall dance till I'm 80. I'll be waltzing grandmother. It's good for me. I need it." They plunged down into the drifts and did not stop again until they reached the wooden bridge. "See, even the creek is frozen. I thought running water never froze. How long will it be like this?" "Not long now. In a month you'll see the green begin in the marsh and run over the meadows. It's lovely over here in the spring, and you'll be able to get out tomorrow, Mrs. Forrester. The clouds are thinning. Look, there's the new moon." She turned. "Oh, I saw it over the wrong shoulder." "No, you didn't. You saw it over mine." She sighed and took his arm. "My dear boy, your shoulders aren't broad enough." Instantly before his eyes rose the image of a pair of shoulders that were very broad, objectively broad, clad in a frock overcoat with Austrian collar. This intrusion of this third person annoyed him as they went slowly back up the hill. Curiously enough, it was Captain Forrester's wife that seemed most interested in Neil, and it was in her relation to her husband that he most admired her. Given her other charming attributes, her comprehension of a man like the railroad builder, her loyalty to him, stamped her more than anything else. That he felt was quality, something that could never be worn or shabby, steel of Damascus. His admiration of Mrs. Forrester went back to that, just as he felt she herself went back to it. He rather liked the stories, even the spiteful ones, about the gay life she led in Colorado and the young man she kept dangling about her every winter. He sometimes thought of the life she might have been living ever since he had known her, and the one she had chosen to live. From the disparity, he believed, came the subtlest thrill of her fascination. She mocked outrageously at the proprieties that she observed and inherited the magic of contradictions.